Republican senators disgraced themselves today, attacking the man who saved lives, possibly millions of lives, during the COVID-19 outbreak. The man who helped speed the development of a vaccine because of the research that he had led and supported on exactly that kind of virus for years before the outbreak of the pandemic, in anticipation of exactly the kind of pandemic that hit the world in 2020. That's why that vaccine that has saved so many of our lives reached us so quickly. And not one senator in that room today did one thing to save a single life during the COVID-19 pandemic. Not one of them. But they lined up to get their COVID-19 vaccine shots as soon as they possibly could. And they never thanked Dr. Fauci for helping speed the development of that vaccine. Anthony Fauci has been attacked before. In the 1980s, when AIDS suddenly began its deadly rampage in the United States, Dr. Fauci led the medical response. He directed and supported research. He directed and supported possible therapeutic treatments and experimental treatments. As more and more people died every day, the communities that disease was ravaging protested. And Dr. Fauci sympathized with the protesters.
There is a feeling among members of any of a number of professions, or just the general population, that patients with AIDS, many of whom are homosexual, are a little bit different. I think that has led to a little bit of a complacency about the approach towards this disease.
Some frustrated and agonized AIDS activists came to Washington and hung Dr. Fauci in effigy outside his office building, objecting to the pace of his work. Dr. Fauci knew that he had to continue his careful, deliberate, scientific approach, but he also felt compelled to explain what he was doing and why it wasn't happening faster. And so he met with the people who attacked him. Dr. Fauci went to Greenwich Village. He went to San Francisco. He met with AIDS activists there, some of whom were calling him a murderer. He listened and he sympathized with them. The loudest and most eloquent voice among the protesters was the playwright Larry Kramer. Larry Kramer screamed at Dr. Fauci repeatedly, called him a murderer, and eventually befriended Tony Fauci as he came to realize that Dr. Fauci was the most effective ally that AIDS activists had. And years later, many years later, after having lived to the age of 84 while being HIV positive, thanks to the medical advances supported by Dr. Fauci, Larry Kramer, on his deathbed, had these last words for his visitor, Tony Fauci. "I love you, Tony." Dr. Fauci said through his tears, "I love you, Larry." Dr. Fauci noted that kind of protest in his diaries in various ways. The Fauci diaries released by Rand Paul revealed someone else saying, "I love you, Tony." The June 2nd, 2020 entry in Dr. Fauci's diary says, quote, "As usual, POTUS was very warm and friendly with me. When he walked into the Oval with us waiting, I was standing next to the door and he said, 'I love you, Tony. I feel like giving you a big hug.'" Rand Paul didn't quote that diary entry today. Some news accounts of Dr. Fauci's diary which reads as a straightforward description, an actual accounting of what was happening to him every day, almost all of which is about the virus he was trying to conquer, find fault with Dr. Fauci for recording things that actually happened to him, like phone calls with Barbra Streisand and other celebrities. Dr. Fauci has been accused of name dropping in his diary, which is impossible because he's name dropping in a document that no one else was ever supposed to read. He mentions names like Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, Leonardo DiCaprio, and Francis Ford Coppola, all in the same sentence, actually, because he mentions them in a diary entry about receiving the Leonardo da Vinci Award from the Italian American Foundation. And so, yeah, some famous Italian Americans were there. The most famous Italian Americans were there. And I don't know anyone who's met those people who hasn't made some kind of note about it and told someone about it. And so Dr. Fauci mentioned those names to his diary, where there is no bragging. There's no bragging in that diary. It's a record of who he met, of who he talked to. There's no excitement. There's no glee about the surge in his fame that he records in his diary. He marvels at the weirdness of it, as has every single person in the history of massive rocketing surges in personal fame. Whenever that happens, people find it strange and disorienting, and that's what Dr. Fauci records, that it was strange and disorienting. 99% of his diary during the COVID-19 pandemic is about the COVID-19 pandemic. There is nothing in the diary that reeks of vanity. Rand Paul has said that Dr. Fauci should be in prison without ever once having named an actual crime that Dr. Fauci could ever be charged with. Anthony Fauci, who has testified to Congress possibly more than any other American in history, decided that today would be different.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Peters, members of the committee, I served at the NIH for over 54 years, 38 of those as director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Over that period, I proved that I believe in and respect the value of legitimate congressional oversight. In fact, I testified before and or briefed Senate and House Senate and House committees well over 200 times over those 38 years. During and after the COVID pandemic, I have appeared multiple times for hearings in the Senate and the House, usually under oath, and sat for several days-long transcribed sworn interviews answering questions about the very issues that are now the subject of this hearing. However, given Senator Paul's obvious obsession with calling for my prosecution, his repeated slanderous comments about me, and recently his publicly releasing my unredacted personal diary aimed at embarrassing and intimidating me, the only conclusion I can reach is that the sole reason he is calling me before this committee is to get me to say something, anything, that could vindicate his repeated public pledges that I end up, in his words, quote, behind bars, unquote. Any reasonable person who has followed his unhinged obsession with me would readily come to the same conclusion. Therefore, although it pains me to do so, because of the respect I have for the legislative branch of government and my decades-long record of cooperating with Congress, under the advice of my attorneys, I will invoke my right under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution to refrain from answering your questions. Thank you.
Anthony Fauci helped save millions of lives with his work on HIV medications. He expanded his life-saving reach to Africa with the support of George W. Bush by creating a President's Emergency Fund to support AIDS treatment in Africa that saved over 25 million lives before Elon Musk and Donald Trump decided that those lives were not worth saving. Not one Republican congressional committee, not one Republican senator is investigating how many thousands of people have died because Donald Trump and Elon Musk took their life-saving HIV medicine away. Not one Republican congressional committee is investigating how many babies have starved to death because Elon Musk decided to let food supplies that had already been delivered to Africa rot in warehouses instead of distributing that food to starving people. That is the Republican contribution to public health in today's world. And not one Republican senator has ever objected to taking that food assistance away from starving children and starving mothers and starving grandmothers, and taking life-saving medicine away from people who cannot get that life-saving medicine any other way. The life-saving medicine that Dr. Anthony Fauci helped them get. There is no higher calling than saving lives. There is nothing we could ever do more important than saving a single life. And most of us will never know that feeling of saving a life. And all of us owe our gratitude to Anthony Fauci, and many of us may owe our lives to Anthony Fauci. And Anthony Fauci owes nothing to Republicans in the United States Senate. He does not owe them an answer to a single question. He's already answered every one of the questions that they were throwing around that room today. He's answered them many times in congressional testimony and in other interviews. Every one of them, every one of those questions, he's answered in previous appearances. Sometimes news stories come down to a very simple right and wrong, and this is one of them. Anthony Fauci is right, and every one of those Republican senators is very, very wrong.